Now, as a child at primary school, when we arrived in South Africa, I had mentioned a bus trip that we took, which was quite influential in my thinking for the rest of my life and is mostly responsible for why I do these videos as I do in my mid-60s. We were taken to a place called Jinjinshlovu, which was the royal kraal of the Zulu king, and he had invited Piet Retief and around 75 of the other leaders of the Boers into the kraal to be given the treaty for a land parcel to be allocated to the Boers to set up some farming lands and establish a colony. It was at this stage that the Zulus asked the Boers to leave their guns outside the kraal, or the residence of the king, as a show of good faith. When the Boers were sat to feast and to drink the beer that the Zulus were offering, the king suddenly stood and said in Zulu, "Bulala lo wizard." My terms. Bulala is to kill, but he was saying kill the wizards, and the Zulu warriors came from behind the huts and they dragged the Boers down to a pit and impaled them with assegais, spears, and clubbed them over their heads with their knobkerries. Now, we were shown the spot as school kids, and I'll never forget it. The pit looked like it still might have bones in there if you were to dig around. I'm sure it didn't. And that started, as I mentioned in the previous talk, the Night of the Tears, where the Zulus rampaged through the other Boers that were waiting for their leaders to return. Now, in consequence of that, as I also mentioned, the Boers regrouped and they rallied, and they realised that the only way to defeat an African army was to form a lager, which was to, as John Wayne would have said, to put your wagons in a circle, round up the wagons, which is what they did at a place called today Blood River. And that was another stop in our school excursion, where they have bronze or recreations of the wagons in bronze in roughly the same defensive circle as was used by the Boers in the early, I want to say around the 1840s. Now, the Boers made a what they called a covenant with God, in that if God protected them and gave them victory, they would forever keep that day as a holiday. The Zulus, against their better judgment and against orders from the king, merely rushed the Boers in their lager and were mowed down by the Boers had Maxim guns or Gatling guns and a steady supply of rifles. The river ran red with the blood of the Zulus, hence the name Blood River. Now, that day, and I think it's in early November, was, while I was living in South Africa, always commemorated as the Day of the Covenant. This was the forming of the national identity known as Afrikanerdom. The Afrikaners spoke a corrupted version of Dutch, or a primitive version of Dutch. And as I said in the other talk, were becoming a nation of their own design. Now, I talked about the families leaving the Cape Colony. They took their women, the children. They also took their servants with them. Although they considered themselves to be God's own chosen, and that the dark-skinned and coloured-skinned peoples were to be, by design of the Bible, to be servants and workers for them, they didn't. They actually took their servants with them as they migrated north. And although they may have considered these coloured people somewhat lesser than them, it didn't stop them breeding with these Khoisan people, and indeed the black-skinned people as they came across them, which created a class of people known as the Cape Coloureds, who are still a force today in South African racial politics, the Cape Coloureds, who still speak Afrikaans or Dutch. Now, the Boers had found Natal to be unsatisfactory, so they also migrated north, and they linked up with the original Trek Boers who had come up from the colony and gone directly up north. And it's at this stage we start to see two colonies or republics being formed. The Republic of the Orange Free State, the Oranje Vrystaat, and the Transvaal were in the process of being formed and settled and farmed. Now, one of the African tribes they clashed with in the Transvaal were the Matabele. And the Matabele were a offshoot of the Zulus, who had split from the Zulus because of the warlike nature of Shaka, king of the Zulus, and settled in the Transvaal. When they clashed with the Boers, the effect was so violent and so disastrous for the Matabele that they themselves as a nation left and migrated north to cross the Limpopo to what is now current-day Zimbabwe. The Boers had to fight all along the way. There is a story of a young Paul Kruger, when he was 14, shooting his first lion, as a young man shooting rhinoceros and the rifle blowing off his thumb, and to avoid the gangrene which had set into his arm and was now up as far as his elbow, he thrust his arm into the gut of a slaughtered goat and apparently saved his arm. So what you're getting at here is a race of people that were tough. They formed commandos, the word we use today. A commando was a group of Boers that would get together to form a military strike party. They might inflict a raid on an African tribe that had been troublesome to them or needed to be taught a lesson, or they may go to the assistance of another community of Boers that were being harassed or attacked by African tribes. So the commando was born, a group of men on horseback with rifles that were mobile, quick, and sharp shooters. These men were handling rifles from a very early age and having to fight for their very existence in the African veldt, from leopard, lion, elephant, rhino, hippo, and of course aggressive, violent African tribes fighting for their existence. The authorities that were in the Cape Province and in Natal, the British authorities, tended to turn a blind eye to these Boers that had left the colony and were establishing the republics. They neither acknowledged or recognised them as independent republics. They still considered them to be British citizens. There was no need to rein them in because they were dirt poor. The republics that were being founded, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, or the South African Republic as it was being called, were dirt poor. They were agricultural societies, and indeed the Boers had no real interest in commercial ventures. They stuck to their Old Testament Bibles. They had farms. They raised large families and kept cattle and grew crops. They were always on the look for for more land, however, and they weren't adverse to helping one African tribe subdue another in exchange for land or for cattle. And it was only when diamonds were discovered in Kimberley, which was in the Cape Colony, but not far from the border with the Orange Free State, that the English started to consider that there may be some wealth in the interior. Also, the English began to be concerned about the turbulence that was being created by the Boers in the interior, in the republics they'd formed. The British liked to create alliances and pacts with various tribes in the thought that they may become useful if they wanted to pit one tribe against another. And in fact, in what was to become Rhodesia, they sent emissaries up to talk to the king of the Matabele, and with the view to being allowed to start looking for minerals in what was to become Rhodesia. And the king, Lobengula, told the British that we respect the British, but we fear the Boers. And the British were able to offer the Matabele's protection against the Boers in exchange for some rifles given to the Matabele's, and the right to look for minerals in what was to become Rhodesia. So the British began to raise eyebrows and to wonder if the Boers needed to be reined in and reminded that in the eyes of the company they were still British citizens. Also, Cecil John Rhodes, as a name you might know, was looking northward from Cape Town. He had a dream of a railway line that ran through British territories from Cape Town to Cairo, and indeed north of what was to become South Africa were all British colonies: Uganda, Kenya, Malawi, and Sudan and Egypt were protectorates. So Zambia, Rhodesia, they were all becoming English colonies, so it wasn't out of the question. Also to be remembered were the Germans had now colonised southwest Africa on the west coast, and the Portuguese owned Mozambique on the east coast. So if these European colonies started looking inwards at these fragile Boer republics that were dirt broke and vulnerable, the British might lose an opportunity. What would happen? The South African Boer War Memorial at Orange in New South Wales. The monument commemorates those who served during the South African Boer War. It is a sandstone plinth supporting a fluted column, in turn supporting a light, and features carvings including a slouch hat with crossed rifles and laurel wreath. It was restored and a plaque added in 2005 to commemorate the centenary of the monument. Taken from the Sydney Morning Herald on the 30th of March 1905. Quote, Orange, Wednesday. A memorial to soldiers who fell in South Africa was unveiled today by Brigadier General Gordon. The first item of the day's program was an inspection of the Orange Company by the General, and this was followed by the presentation to Private Alfred Paulson of the South African Medal. The General addressed the company on various matters, particularly on the lessons to be gathered from the war in the East. At 11 o'clock, General Gordon was received by the Mayor at the Town Hall and welcomed there by a number of prominent citizens. The health of the guest was honoured, and the General, in replying, referred to the necessity of adequate preparation for defence and pointed out that a new power had arisen in the East. The unveiling ceremony followed. The memorial, which has been erected at the intersection of Sumner and Anson Streets, is in the form of a pillar on plinth, surmounted by double lamps, and is the work of Messrs. McCurdy brothers of Orange. General Gordon referred to the admirable services of Australians in South Africa and to the patriotism displayed by the colonials, which they had in common with other necessary qualities to make good soldiers, and appealed to all to evince more sympathy with the defence of Australia, and concluded refuting the calamities that had been levelled against the Australian soldiers in South Africa. He then unveiled the memorial, the ceremony being followed by the playing of the national anthem by the massed bands and the singing of the anthem by the school children. Details of the monument. The front inscription reads, Pro Patria Semper, Memoriam Sergeant Major J.S. Smith, Trooper E.J. Conybeare, Trooper H.S.T.J. Beasley, Trooper M.I. Bastick, unveiled by Brigadier General Gordon CB, Commandant of the New South Wales Forces on the 29th of the 3rd, 1905. The left side of the inscription reads, Ladysmith, Pretoria. The back inscription reads, to commemorate the patriotism of the contingent from this district, South African War 1898 to 1902. The right side inscription reads, Kimberley, Mafeking. Inscription in proximity, the plaque, Orange. This plaque commemorates the centenary of the Boer War Memorial and was unveiled by Councillor John Davis, Mayor, on the 29th of March 2005. The memorial has been restored with assistance from the Commonwealth Department of Veteran Affairs.